Something I hear a lot from folks trying to get a handle on their health is this really central question. Are plant-based diets actually better? It feels like a key piece of understanding how we should eat. And I know you want to get straight to the insights without, getting bogged down.
Absolutely. It's a topic loaded with interest for sure. And when we talk about plant-based diets, it's probably helpful to have a shared understanding first. Drawing from one of our sources today, we're looking at it as covering both vegetarian approaches. So plant foods are the foundation, but maybe dairy or eggs are included. And then vegan diets, which are, entirely plant-based.
Okay.
It's also worth keeping in mind, though, some people use plant-based just to describe diets that still have some animal products, just maybe less of them.
Right. So it's kind of a spectrum of eating habits. And what we're aiming to do today isn't really to declare one way of eating the winner. No. Instead, we're doing a deep dive into the research, looking at those big long-term studies you hear about, like Epic Oxford and the UK Biobank, plus some systematic reviews, to really unpack the potential upsides, but also look honestly at any possible drawbacks, just focusing on the evidence.
Exactly. And often when people think about plant-based diets, the first things that come to mind are, low saturated fat, high fiber. And that generally holds true, which brings known benefits. But the full picture has more layers. There are potential nutritional things we need to explore too.
Okay, let's unpack that. You mentioned nutritional considerations. What are the key nutrients we should be kind of aware of?
Yeah, so the main ones that pop up consistently are vitamin B12, vitamin D, calcium, and also iodine. These are particularly important to keep in mind for people following a strict vegan diet because these nutrients are usually found more easily in animal-derived foods.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, now a really big topic that always comes up is body weight. What does the research actually tell us about plant-based diets and our weight?
Well, the data pretty consistently shows that vegetarians and vegans tend to have a lower body mass index, BMI, compared to meat eaters. And it often goes hand in hand with lower levels of LDL cholesterol, that's the so-called bad cholesterol, and healthier blood pressure readings too.
And is that lower BMI, is that the main reason we sometimes see other health benefits linked to these diets?
In quite a few instances, it looks like it's a really significant factor.
Yeah.
For example, the Epic Oxford study saw a lower risk of developing diabetes in vegetarians and vegans. But what's really interesting there is that this reduced risk seems largely connected to their lower average BMI.
Ah, okay.
And we saw something similar in a Spanish study, too. Those on plant-based diets generally had lower BMI. So it suggests the weight management part of these diets plays a big role in some health outcomes.
So that's fascinating. It's not just about cutting out animal products driving that diabetes benefit necessarily, but the impact on weight that often comes with it. What other specific health outcomes did that Epic Oxford study highlight? Any others?
Yeah, the Epic Oxford data did point to some potentially protective effects for vegetarians. They showed a relatively lower risk of ischemic heart disease. That's where blood supply to the heart is reduced, plus the lower diabetes risk we just mentioned, and also a lower incidence of diverticular disease, kidney stones, cataracts, and maybe even some types of cancer.
That sounds pretty positive. Were there any downsides, any areas where vegetarians seem to face maybe a higher risk?
Yes, there were a couple flagged. Vegetarians in that study showed a relatively higher risk of stroke, specifically hemorrhagic stroke, that's the bleeding type in the brain.
Okay.
And also a slightly increased risk of bone fracture. Now, when we look specifically at vegans, the fracture picture was a bit different. They had a higher risk of all fractures, and notably a significantly higher risk of hip fractures.
Oh, wow. Hip fracture specifically.
Yeah. And what was also interesting was that this higher fracture risk in vegans seemed more pronounced in those who had a lower BMI.
That link between lower BMI and higher fracture risk in vegans is definitely something to keep in mind. What about cancer risk overall? You mentioned it briefly.
Yeah, so overall, the Epic Oxford study found a slightly lower risk of all cancers combined to vegetarians, and then an even further reduction in risk for vegans compared to the meat eaters. But it's really crucial to remember that when you drill down into specific types of cancer, the findings often need more research.
Why is that?
Well, because so many things, like smoking, for instance, can strongly influence cancer risk. And even when researchers try their best to adjust for these confounders, there might still be other factors at play they haven't captured.
Right, got it. So more work needed on specific cancers. Okay, let's circle back to those micronutrients. You mentioned a systematic review gave a broader view. What did that tell us about nutrient intakes and sort of status levels in people on plant-based diets?
Yeah, that systematic review was really helpful, gave a comprehensive overview. It identified several nutrients where plant-based diets, especially vegan ones, might fall short. For vegans, these included EPA and DHA. Those are the important omega-3s you often get from fish, the marine ones. Also vitamin B12, vitamin D, calcium, iodine, and even iron for women, and zinc.
And for vegetarians, similar picture.
Some overlap, yes. For vegetarians, the potential risks highlighted were particularly for vitamin B12, vitamin D, iodine, iron again, especially in women, and zinc.
Okay, B12 keeps coming up. Why is that such a key one to flag?
Well, vitamin B12 is primarily found in animal products. Simple as that, really. The review found that B12 intake was inadequate in most of the vegan studies they looked at, and about half of the vegetarian ones. And this lack of intake often led to pretty high rates of actual deficiency in both groups.
So what's the solution?
Vegans really need to make sure they're getting B12 from fortified foods, like some plant milks or cereals, or take supplements. Vegetarians can get some from dairy and eggs, but maybe not always enough compared to meat eaters.
Okay, what about vitamin D and calcium? Both vital for bones, right?
Absolutely. And studies showed that both vegans and vegetarians tended to have lower levels of vitamin D circulating in their blood. For calcium, it was interesting, intake was actually slightly higher in vegetarians compared to both vegans and meat eaters in the study's review.
Really?
Yeah, but despite that, inadequacy in calcium intake was still reported across all dietary groups. So it's a nutrient many people might not be getting enough of, regardless of diet.
And iron and zinc, we hear a lot about those with plant-based eating too.
Exactly. Plant-based diets don't contain heme iron, which is the type from animal sources that our body absorbs more easily. And the review did highlight inadequate iron intake among women following these diets, which is a common concern anyway for women.
Right.
For zinc, while the average amounts people ate were similar across different diets, the bioavailability of zinc, basically, how much our bodies can actually absorb and use, is lower from plant foods. In fact, the average zinc intake for vegetarian and vegan men in the reviewed studies was actually below the estimated amount they need.
So it's not just about the amount you eat, but how well your body can actually use the nutrients from those foods. That's key.
Precisely. But, on a more positive note, the review also found that plant-based diets tend to be really rich in several beneficial things, like fiber, those healthy polyunsaturated fats, ALA, that's another type of omega-3 found in plants, and various vitamins like B1, B6, C, E, folate, plus magnesium. So definite plus points there.
Okay. What about protein? Is getting enough protein a realistic concern with plant-based diets?
That's a common question. Interestingly, the review indicated that while protein intake was generally a bit lower in vegetarians and vegans compared to meat eaters, it still fell well within the acceptable recommended range in the studies they looked at.
So not usually a major issue then?
It seems overall protein deficiency isn't a widespread problem in, well-planned plant-based diets for adults. Planning is key.
Right. Now, we've been talking a lot about whole plant foods, fruits, veg, legumes, but there's been this huge explosion in plant-based alternatives, right? What about those ultra-processed plant-based foods, the fake meats, the vegan cheeses we see everywhere now?
Yeah, that's a really important point to bring up. It's absolutely essential to understand that not all plant-based diets are created equal in terms of health. We're seeing this massive increase in ultra-processed options, imitation meats, dairy alternatives, ready meals. And while they can be convenient, maybe help people transition, we still have, frankly, gaps in our knowledge about their long-term nutritional effects.
How so?
Well, for example, they can be quite high in salt. And they might not provide the same matrix of nutrients and fiber as the whole minimally processed plant foods they're replacing. We definitely need more research in this area to fully understand their impact on health over time.
That makes a lot of sense. Just because the label says plant-based doesn't automatically mean it's the healthiest choice available. Now, that Spanish study you mentioned earlier, it looked beyond just the food, didn't it? What did it find about the sort of overall lifestyle?
Yeah, that study gave a really interesting, broader picture. It found that individuals in Spain following vegetarian or vegan diets didn't just tend to have lower BMIs. They also reported consuming fewer of those less healthy things like fried foods, fast food, ultra-processed items, sugary drinks, and alcohol.
So it seems like the dietary choice might often be part of a bigger package of health-conscious behaviors.
Exactly. That's what it suggests. The Spanish study also found those on plant-based diets tended to do more physical activity, get more sleep, and were less likely to smoke. A whole pattern.
Okay.
However, it also raised a point worth considering. They observed a potential trend of more diagnosed eating disorders within these groups, which really just highlights the importance of getting professional support, maybe from a doctor or dietitian, when making significant dietary changes.
Right, good point. It sounds like for many people, choosing a plant-based diet lines up with a broader focus on health and well-being. What about the bigger picture implications, the environmental stuff, economic aspects? Do the sources touch on that?
Yes, they do. There's a growing body of evidence suggesting plant-based diets have the potential to significantly reduce our environmental footprint. Producing plant foods generally results in lower greenhouse gas emissions, uses less land, and can be better for biodiversity compared to raising livestock.
Okay.
And furthermore, some research indicates that if more people shifted towards eating less meat, it could lead to pretty considerable savings in healthcare costs down the line.
So potential benefits not just for us individually, but maybe for the planet and our health systems too. So for someone listening now who's thinking, okay, maybe I want to move towards a more plant-based way of eating, what would be some key takeaways from our discussion today? What's the advice?
Well, I think for anyone new to this, making changes gradually can be a really good approach. Focus on incorporating more plant-forward meals rather than feeling you have to switch overnight.
So evolution, not revolution.
Exactly. And emphasizing minimally processed plant foods, the whole grains, fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, seeds, that's really important. Getting the foundation right. And as we've discussed quite a bit, while well-planned plant-based diets can be nutritionally adequate, it does require paying attention, especially to those key micronutrients like B12, vitamin D, calcium, iodine, particularly if you're following a vegan diet where those animal sources are completely excluded.
So when we loop all the way back to that initial question, are plant-based diets actually better? It really sounds like the answer is, but it's complicated.
That's right. It's nuanced. The research clearly points to some promising benefits areas like managing weight, lower LDL cholesterol, better blood pressure, potentially lower risk for certain diseases. And alongside those, the significant potential environmental advantages. That's all there in the data. However, it also really highlights the crucial need for careful planning to make sure you're getting all the nutrients you need. It might not be the ideal approach for everyone without that proper consideration and planning.
And it's so important for you listening to remember that the information we've talked about today comes from the research we analyzed for this deep dive. How your body responds to dietary changes can be quite individual.
Absolutely. Which leads to, I think, a really interesting final thought for you to ponder. Given this dual potential benefits for our own health and for the planet's health that can come with more plant-based eating, how can you personally make informed choices about maybe incorporating more plant foods into your diet while making absolutely sure your own individual nutritional needs are being met? Especially when you consider this constantly changing landscape of plant-based products out there. It's definitely something worth exploring further as you think about your own long-term health and well-being.